I'm Tabarez Neyazi, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and New Media. So I will be chairing this session. So that this is the title of our panel is Human Dynamics Upon Crisis. And we have three excellent speakers from NUS. So we have here Professor Feng Chen-Chieh from Department of Geography. We have Michelle from Associate Professor from Department of Psychology. And we have Yingwei, as a Senior Lecturer from Department of Geography. So first, I would like to invite Professor Feng Chen-Chieh to speak on what the public feels and think during an endemic crisis.
Let me get started. Thanks, Tabarez. It's my pleasure to give a talk on the work we did last year on this topic called what public feels and thinks during an epidemic crisis in this forum. My name is Chen-Chieh Feng, and like Tabarez says, I'm from Department of Geography. Okay, so coming from Department of Geography and under the theme of computational social sciences, so we're coming from this angle of geographic information system, and with respect to human dynamics, we're typically focusing on computational kind of representation about mobility, for example. The example on the right, you see the daily mobility pattern for individual represented by the dark blue lines. And then there are several layers of the environment they interact with. So you would imagine this kind of things would enable you to look at human interaction, to look at their environmental exposure, for example, which are related to environmental health kind of research. The lower right corner, that's just an example of the dashboard, which is related to the keynote last night. The dashboard about the status of the public transportation availability in Singapore. Okay, so coming from the mobility, so we're looking at, if we're looking at the intersections of GS and human dynamics, we're not only looking at the physical space, and with the proliferation of the ICT, we're also looking at the virtual space because the interaction can go on there as well. And of course, there's the crossover between physical and the virtual space. But in any case, a lot of time we're interested in looking at virtual space and the interaction there, at least as partial evidence of the human dynamics. And the other things about understanding the human dynamics, we probably have to go from spatial to placial. This means that to understand it, we need to know more about the context. So any piece of information, either physical spaces or virtual spaces, is important. Okay. So in this context, and zooming into the sessions about crisis, and of course, we can look at different kind of crisis. And if we focus on the virtual space, we're probably looking at user-generated content, or in geography, that would be called a volunteer geographic information. Okay, so these are related to information that you could harvest from, for example, social media. Okay. And specifically, from our angle, we're probably focusing more on the spatial temporal changes related to various crises. Okay. So some of the examples that I'm listed here would be compliance to evacuation procedures, or to use the Flickr to look at Flickr images to look at the level of post-disaster recovery. We did use Twitter to look at, this is the case in the MERS in Korea. So we're looking at the risk communication strategies and how information diffuse across different area of Korea. Okay. So we can also look at humanitarian crisis. And the last one is the most relevant to what I want to talk about for this presentation. which is on the sentiment and the mental health related to COVID-19. And the two citations right here, one is the sentiment and health related to the sentiment and mental health. The work is done in India. The second one, Li et al., is done in China. So we thought that this kind of sentiment responses is probably dependent on different locations and dependent on different contexts. And we also want to think about the temporal changes of the sentiment as well. So that kind of inspired us to do this particular research, and it's related to the circuit breaker in Singapore. Okay, so now we all know that the circuit breaker started on the 7th of April. Okay, so at that time, we didn't know exactly when it would end, so I put a question mark there. So that represents a little bit of uncertainties about what's going on next. And of course, by now we know that the circuit breaker got extended and then eventually it ends on the 1st of June. Okay. So what we know in terms of mobility, and it's actually the reverse of it, which is the restricted mobility that non-essential services either shut down or we have to work from home. Schools are 100% online teaching. What we didn't know a lot at that time is about the impact of CB on the residents' emotions and also the changes of their sentiment. So at that point, the CB started on the 7th of April, and we're a little bit late. We're actually thinking about what we want to do with it. But eventually we started collecting data directly from the Twitter message, starting from the 16th of April all the way to the end of the CB. So real-time tweets as it progresses during CB using the keywords of COVID and the coronavirus. Okay, so we follow the standard procedure to collect the data and pre-process the data and identify the valid users. Basically means individuals who's posting and not the news outlet, for example. And then the valid user has to be located in Singapore, so they're experiencing CB at the time. And like I said, we were interested in the change of the sentiment as well. So what we did next is to collect the data from the start of the year, so January 1st to the 31st of May, using the set of valid user ID and through Twitter API. And this time we're not just collecting COVID or coronavirus, but all the tweets posted by these the set of valid users. Okay. So again, we follow the standard procedure. But one thing that I want to highlight is that we collected tweets of all languages. Okay, so because later we want to see if the sentiment responses are slightly different across different languages. So as the baseline, we also collected the tweets from January 1st to the 31st of May, but in 2019. So we get a sense about what's going on in the preceding year, and then also look at what's going on during the COVID year of 2020. Okay, so the 2019 data are basically the baseline data. So very quickly about, like I said, these are pretty much standard procedures. So I just have one slide on the analysis framework and tool. So just to facilitate the understanding of the output. Okay, so we're working on the changes of the sentiment. So we started with the emotional valence values and also looking at the 8 emotions: joy versus sadness, anger versus fear, trust versus disgust, and surprise versus anticipation. Okay. So in terms of the analysis, we follow the standard procedure to pre-process the tweets and then use a package in R for sentiment analysis that would extract the 8 emotions and ran the standard stationary test for time series data to look at whether or not the sentiment fluctuates fluctuation is statistically significant. And then in the end, we have a very simple hierarchical clustering for looking at the sentiment response across different languages and see if they are similar in certain way. All right, so here comes the result starting from the overall emotional valence. Okay, so the two pie charts shows the result for 2019 and 2020. And you will see that the zero emotional valence values are pretty similar. So they're not much of a changes. And it's good to see that the positive emotional valence for both 2019 and even in 2020, they're in the majority. So more positive than negative. And as expected in 2020, there's slightly higher negative EV values from 29.4 in 2019 to 35 in 2020. So we did a little bit of the statistical test to basically ensure that this drop is actually statistically significant. Okay, so now we know overall speaking, there's a little bit of drop. So now if we look into the time series data, okay, so the red line basically represents the emotional valence changes over the 5-month period. Okay. So obviously there are fluctuation on both years, but then we look at both year, the first day of the year, there's a high emotional valence, means very positive. So we're kind of puzzled about that and look into the tweet messages and realize a lot of these are related to Happy New Year's. So that the puzzle is solved. We know what's going on there. And then if we focus into the chart on the right, the year of 2020, there's the first dip near the end of January, and then a second dip after Dorscon turned orange. Okay. So I guess that's expected because people doesn't know there's a lot of uncertainty involved. Okay. So a little bit surprised at the start of the CB, the EV doesn't really drop a lot. Of course, there's fluctuation, and as the CB extended, there's not much of a drop. Actually, the overall trend actually goes up a little bit. Okay, so but by the end of the CB actually dropped. Okay, so that was a surprise to us. So we look into the tweets, we realize a lot of these tweets about infections. So we're hypothesizing that perhaps people are thinking when the CB is lifted, then there's some chance that the infection rate would go up. Okay. So this is just a very quick on the stationary test, and I wouldn't bog you down with all the numbers, but just to say that all this number with 1 star on the upper right corner means that they're statistically significant, and that means I think it passed the stationary test. The fluctuation is not significant. Okay, all right. So you see a whole bunch of numbers that with the star on the upper right corner, except that for trust, both year you don't see that, which means that the fluctuation is real. But then the trust for both 2019 and 2020, they both fluctuate. So I think the conditions are, even though we have COVID in 2020, the fluctuation remains the same. The only probably things that we can highlight is about the joy, where in 2020 actually has changed a bit. Okay, so the rest of the trend, the rest of the emotion, the fluctuation of the trend is stationary. So not much of a change statistically. So if we break it down to individual 8 emotions, so as expected, we already know that higher proportion of positive sentiment types for both years. And the top 3, you have trust on top, probably because the Singaporeans trusting the measure imposed by the government, and also, I suppose, the local residents. Okay, so you have trust, you have anticipation, and you have joy on top. So represented by the green and kind of pink and orange line. And then there are lower proportion of negative sentiment types for both year, and the disgust and the anger being the lowest. So the third bullet point are the things that we can observe from the time series is slightly higher proportion of negative sentiments in 2020. This is something we know from the previous slides. And the last thing about this fear, okay, so for year of 2020, there's a rise of fear around mid to late March, as well as toward the end of May 2020. So coincidentally, these are basically days prior than the start of the CB and the end of CB. So definitely the traders are showing something, hopefully. And these are also about the fear of uncertainty, probably the fear about increase of infections. So the other part of the analysis result is related to language. Okay, so just to present the fact that of the 5-month periods, all the tweets that we collected represents 105 languages. Okay, so if we zoom into the top 10, coming from English to Hindi, okay, so the most important points that I want to highlight is the 4 languages of the major ethnic groups in Singapore were among the top 10. Okay. So obviously English would be high on top with 84.5%. But then we all know that ethnic Chinese is the largest, but then the tweets in Chinese is only at the 7th place. Okay. So we hypothesized that those non-English tweets might correspond to Twitter users that has its own specific community to communicate, to look for information and the way to respond. But then if they can use English, they will still use English. Okay, so that's one thing that I want to highlight. And then from there, in the next few slides, you will see a chart like this, where the top is the overall emotional valence. And after the top row, you see individual emotional valence for different languages. Okay. So the dark line in the middle basically represents the daily emotional balance. And then the gray, I suppose, the gray buffer or the gray area around the dark line represents the standard deviation. It's actually the 3-day moving average depicted at the 2 standard deviation. Okay. So basically you will see in the next 3 or 4 slides this kind of charts, and I'm gonna kind of highlight a few differences across languages. Okay, but first right here, given that English accounts for 84.5%, so the first thing I realized that the overall response is basically identical to English. And in terms of fluctuation pattern, relatively stable over for English and Japanese and Chinese tweets, meaning that if you look at the gray area, they are quite narrow from February to June. Okay, but then for both Chinese and Japanese tweets showed moderate fluctuation in January, meaning the gray area is larger. And then for Malay and Indonesian tweets show slightly different patterns in April and May, where the Indonesian language has a wider gray area, meaning the fluctuation in terms of emotional valence is higher. So if we break it down to individual 8 emotions, so as described earlier, that the positive emotion responses are higher. So you see for individual languages, the green line is always on top. All right, so that represents trust, except for Japanese, where the anticipation is slightly higher than the green one, which is trust. And there's some other interesting observation about Korean, number F in the second row, where the trust, anticipation, and joy kind of cluster together and there's a clear separation from the rest. And the same applies to Tamil and Hindi on the third row, where the trust stands on top and the rest kind of cluster together. Okay. All right, so I suppose the main point was when you look at different languages in terms of responses, perhaps the user using different languages would have slightly different way of responding to CB, responding to COVID-19. So that's a little bit about the similarity of the response. So we're looking at similarity across different languages, basically looking at similarity of their time series. So just to highlight these two groups, okay. So for joy and fear, they're very similar. Surprise, sadness, and disgust are also very similar. But there are also a little bit of dissimilarity. For example, Indonesian for joy is similar to Chinese, and then when they combine together is similar to Tamil. But then obviously for fear is changing to the right side, which is more similar to Malay, Filipino, English, and Japanese altogether. So the same applies to the right group. So the Malay has changed from the left side for surprise to the right side for sadness, and then the left side for disgust. So there's quite a bit of, I suppose, similarity changes across different language for different emotions. Okay, so I guess I'm 1 minute over time, so I'm just going to quickly go through the conclusion. So basically, we're looking at the emotional responses, okay, as part of the inquiry about the human dynamics. And there's a high level of trust and positive attitude facing the COVID-19 crisis, specifically related to circuit breaker. And then there are many sentiment types that remain stationary. So even though their fluctuation, the fluctuation is not huge, and they do not vary significantly during and before COVID-19. And last is just some facts about differences and evidence about differences in emotion for people in different language groups. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chen-Chieh, a very interesting presentation. So if anyone has any question, you can type it in Q&A and we will take it towards the end. So now I invite Professor Chen-Chieh.
Okay, can y'all see my screen now?
Yes.
And you can hear me. Okay, well, I just want to start by thanking Tabarez for inviting me to participate in this forum, and thank you for your very generous introduction. These are actually data that I haven't presented before, so I'm nervous, but I'm also excited to share them with you. By the way, I'm Michelle, as Tabarez has introduced, and I'm an associate professor here at NUS Psychology, and I'm also a principal investigator at the Center for Trusted Internet and Community, CITIC. So first, I just want to thank my former master student, Farila Abdulhalikan, for assisting with collecting the data for this project. And I also want to thank CITIC for providing the funding for this project. So we all know that, COVID-19, this is not the first crisis in human history, right? There have been other crises before this. And not surprisingly, in social psychology itself, there have been many theories on how human beings psychologically react to different kinds of threats. So being psychologists, we're interested in what the threat is about. Is it somebody's sense of control that's being threatened? Is it somebody's sense of personal uncertainty that's being threatened? Or is it even somebody's fear of death that is triggering psychological processes? Now, all these theories may differ in terms of the core motive that they argue to motivate human behavior, but they also have a common theme, which is that in these theories, the empirical research that is guided by these theories shows that when people are threatened, okay, what happens is that they amplify their default tendencies. They become more extreme. They double down. Okay, so what this means is that there isn't a transition, for instance, for a liberal to become conservative during a crisis or during when they're facing threat. Okay, instead what you have is conservatives become more conservative, liberals become more liberal. Okay, as another example, this could also mean that somebody who tends to be high in prejudice becomes even higher in prejudice, but somebody who is normally low in prejudice, they become even lower in prejudice. Okay, so just to give you an example of the theoretical framework, according to terror management theory, which is about our fear of death, how we cope with our fear of death, we humans have this natural instinct of survival, which is what we share with other animals, but we also know that we're all going to die someday. Okay, now facing these thoughts, we don't just sit in a corner and ball ourselves up and stop living. Okay, so we're pretty resilient. Now, how do we do that? How do we cope with our fear of death instead of giving up and saying, well, what's the point? We're all going to die someday. What we do is we defend our worldview. Okay, so what is a worldview? A worldview is anything that can give you a sense of meaning and order, and even help you attain symbolic or literal immortality. So your religion could be your worldview, your political opinions could be your worldview. And today, the worldview that I'm going to look at is the idea of global orientation. Okay, so in the current research, what we did was we actually manipulated the salience of COVID-19. What this means is that participants were randomly assigned to a low salience condition versus a high salience condition for COVID-19. And then we looked at their willingness to interact with immigrants. Okay, so remember I said that people have default tendencies that get amplified during threat, such as when they're trying to cope with their fear of death. This is an example of a default tendency that I was examining to see if it would amplify. Okay, so this is the construct global orientation, and it essentially taps into people's perceived ability to navigate intercultural contact. Okay, so it consists of both multicultural acquisition and ethnic protection. And so example items would be, I learn and speak languages other than my mother tongue. I read books or magazines to obtain knowledge about other cultures. So if you agree with these statements to a great extent, then you're considered as high in multicultural acquisition and also high in your perceived ability to navigate intercultural contact. Okay. The other component of global orientation is ethnic protection. Okay, so examples of items would be, I stick to the norms of my own culture no matter where I am. Okay, I make friends mostly with people of the same cultural origin as mine. So if you were to endorse these statements to a less extent, then presumably you have higher global orientation compared to somebody else who endorses these items to a greater extent. Okay, so in the experiment that was conducted, 210 Singapore citizens were randomly assigned to salient versus non-salient conditions. So the idea of random assignment, maybe most of you already know this, but just in case, the purpose is to ensure that individual differences like pre-existing prejudices, sex, age, okay, these variables are evenly distributed across the conditions, thus ruling out these variables as confounding variables. Okay, so by the way, sensitivity analysis suggests that 210 is a big enough sample size for us to detect an effect size that is between small and medium, considering the number of predictors we have. Okay, so the overall design, you can consider it as a 2x2, right, with COVID-19 salience as a discrete variable and global orientation as low versus high, although it is a continuous variable in this design. Okay, so what we see here, what do the results tell us? What we see here is when we assessed participants' willingness to interact with mainland Chinese immigrants. So, to what extent were they willing to interact with someone who is from mainland China, with that person being a boss or a colleague or a friend, okay? So this was the outcome. So when we looked at the no COVID-19 salience condition, what we find is, as expected, right? The higher somebody's global orientation is, the more willing they are to interact with mainland Chinese immigrants, okay? So there's nothing surprising about this. And what we find also is that in the COVID-19 salience condition, this tendency get amplified, right? So you see here that the effects of global orientation on willingness to interact becomes even larger, okay? So in case you're curious, in the no COVID-19 salience condition, global orientation accounted for 6% of the unique variance in willingness to interact. In the COVID-19 salience condition, global orientation accounted for as much as 28% of the unique variance in people's willingness to interact with mainland Chinese immigrants. Okay, so there's actually more than 4 times the amount of unique variance that global orientation predicts. Okay, so essentially the role of global orientation in predicting willingness to interact becomes intensified in COVID-19 salient condition. Okay. We also looked at participants' support for cultural ideologies, and there were 4 cultural ideologies we looked at. So everybody responded to the extent, what extent to which they supported these ideologies. And so we have color blindness. Okay, example items include all humans are fundamentally the same. It is important to pay attention to the individual characteristics that make a person unique. There's also multiculturalism. We must appreciate unique characteristics of people from different countries of origin. Learning about ways that people from different countries of origin resolve conflict can help us develop a more harmonious society. We also assessed support for assimilation. Okay. Children from all countries of origin should be taught mainstream Singaporean values. Okay, and so for assimilation, just a note about it, that it seems perfectly fine. Like this is what we should expect people to do. When in Rome, do what the Romans do. However, it is associated with more negative attitudes toward minority groups because these items actually capture the belief that in a culture, there is a dominant group and the other subordinate groups should submit, should assimilate to the dominant group, okay? So that's assimilation. And then lastly, there's segregation, which is people are naturally more comfortable living among others from the same country of origin. Okay, so if we look at these 4 cultural ideologies, they can be considered as differing along 2 dimensions. Okay, the first dimension is positivity toward minorities. Okay, so normally, you would expect, for instance, policymakers to be interested in increasing color blindness and multiculturalism, right? Because these are the 2 ideologies that are associated with positivity toward minorities, okay? And also normally you might expect policymakers to be interested in decreasing support or increasing rejection of assimilationism and segregationism, because endorsement of these cultural ideologies are associated with negativity toward minorities. Okay, so that's one dimension that these ideologies differ on. The other dimension is in terms of the extent to which the cultural ideology highlights group differences versus ignores group differences. So you'll see here that color blindness and assimilation, okay, they're both ideologies that are more about ignoring group differences. Okay, whereas for multiculturalism and segregationism, these are two ideologies that are more about highlighting and celebrating group differences between groups. Okay, so let's see what we have in terms of the results. So on the left-hand side here, what you'll see is that these are all statistically significant from each other, as were the results I presented before. The interaction was significant, the simple slopes were significant. Okay, so back to this one. With results, what we have is that, okay, in the no COVID-19 salience condition, people expressed the most preference for multiculturalism. Okay, and then second most preferred is color blindness. And then third is assimilation, and fourth is segregationism. So nobody likes segregationism, okay? So then the question is, does COVID-19 salience make any difference to people's support for ideology? And what we find is that, you know, support for multiculturalism, it didn't increase, so it stayed the same. Okay, people still really disliked segregationism as before. Okay, but what's changed here is that people aren't distinguishing between assimilation and color blindness the way they were doing it before. Okay, so before in the no COVID condition, people did have a preference for color blindness over assimilation. But now in the COVID-19 salience condition, okay, there is no, people like assimilation and color blindness equally. So we also looked at other outcomes such as trust of media and trust of government. So we asked people, to what extent do you think that the information from MOH was accurate, trustworthy, reliable, etc. So I can say that for trust of government or trust of MOH, the information from MOH, it remained high regardless of salience condition. So it was about, the mean was 4.1 and the maximum possible score was 5. Okay, what about trust of different news media? So what we have here is, this is on a 1 to 7 scale. So you can see that people's trust of TV news and news websites, such as actually local news websites like CNA, Straits Times, Mothership, their trust remained high regardless of whether COVID was salient or not. Okay, and their trust of Facebook, Twitter, and their friends, this trust remained low regardless of whether COVID-19 was salient or not. Okay, so what are the conclusions? What the results suggest is that COVID-19 had a causal effect on amplifying the tendencies of global orientation to predict acceptance of immigrants. So what? The implication is that increasing people's global orientation is potentially an effective intervention, or at least a buffer in terms of decreased acceptance of immigration during times of crisis. Second conclusion from the results here is that COVID-19 led to more weight of sameness than valence in terms of distinctions between ideologies. And in terms of sameness, I'm talking about sameness between groups, okay? So what this means is that there should be targeted efforts. We don't actually, there's nothing we can do actually with multiculturalism and segregationism, okay? Because the support for multiculturalism remained high. The rejection of segregationism remained high, regardless of whether COVID-19 salient or not. But what we see changing is people's support for color blindness and their rejection of assimilation. So then one implication of these findings that I just presented is that there should be targeted efforts focusing on these particular two cultural ideologies if we want to increase support for cultural ideologies that involve positivity toward minority groups, and if we want to maintain rejection of cultural ideologies that involve negativity toward minority groups. And with that, I would like to end my talk today, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Michelle, for such a very interesting talk. I think a lot of takeaway from your talk. So we will take the Q&A towards the end. So now I would like to invite Professor Yingwei from Department of Geography.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, thank you for your kind introduction. It's my great pleasure to be here to present my work at Global Research Forum. So please allow me to share my screen first. Okay, this is the slides. Do you see it?
Yes.
Thank you. So this is the topic of my presentation today. I'm going to talk about modeling tourist distribution based on geotech social media data for facilitating disaster and crisis management. I'm Yingwei from Geography Department, and I work on GIS as well. So this work has already been published in this journal, International Journal of Geographical Information Science already. So before I talk about this paper, I would like to talk a little bit about VGI. Professor Feng just talked about volunteer geographic information. This is my research focus. And so social media is actually is a type of VGI, volunteer geographic information. So this is a word cloud showing some main VGI platforms or applications. The most popular one is OpenStreetMap. So it's a open source mapping community where people can contribute data freely and download data freely for mapping or analysis purpose. So the other type of VGI is the social media. So for instance, we have the Twitter data, Flickr data, and Facebook data. So for today's presentation, I'm going to focus on this one, Flickr data. So this term, VGI, was coined in 2007 in the field of GIS science. So since the coining of this term, it has become one of the most popular research topic in GIS science. So you can see since the coining of this term in 2007. So in the 10 years since the coining of this term, you can see the increase of research articles that have been published in the mainstream GIS journals. You can see the number of skyrocketing. And on the right side, we also summarized the main terms that are related to VGI. For instance, the most popular two are user-generated content and crowdsourcing. These two are usually used more often in the field of computer science, but in geography or in GIS, VGI is used more often because we would like to emphasize or highlight the geospatial component. We focus on those information that have geographic information or geographic coordinates. So we have other related terms like neogeography, citizen science, citizen acting as sensors, participatory GIS, public participation GIS, and social media web 2.0. Okay. Recently, we also conducted a review to review the articles published in mainstream GIS journals related to VGI. And this table summarized the 3 research themes on the VGI. The first one is VGI contributions and the contributors. And second one is the main fields applying VGI. And the third one is the conceptions and the envisionings. So today I'm going to focus on this one, the second one, with special focus on the second bullet point, disaster, crisis, emergency, and hazard management. So this review article has also been published in this journal as well. Okay, so because this conference is about computational social science, for disaster and crisis management, we also have a related term called computational social science of disaster and crisis. So it's an intersection among social science, computational methods, and disaster and crisis research. So in between, we have the computational social science and disaster and crisis. Computational social science is here, which is the intersection of social science and computational methods. And this part is the crisis information processed by computational methods. And here we have the disaster and the crisis social science. So for disaster and the crisis management research or practice, we usually look at four phases included in this disaster and crisis management cycle. The four phases are, this is the first one, mitigation, which is more about prevention or capacity building. And the next one is about preparedness, which is more about early warning, pre-impact early warning. And the third one is about response, which is more about search and rescue and emergency relief. And last one is about recovery. So recently, we also conducted some research about post-disaster recovery evaluation based on social media. But in this presentation, I would like to focus on this paper that I just introduced, in which the Flickr data was used to model tourist distribution. So this work was conducted in together with my collaborators in Heidelberg University in Germany, related to this project, under this project called CrowdFDA, Crowdsourcing for Forensic Disaster Analysis. So basically, what we did was to model the distribution of tourists in order to facilitate disaster and crisis management. So with the understanding of tourist distribution, the information or the map will be very useful in disaster and crisis scenarios. So for instance, if we have a map showing the tourist distribution in tourism destinations, policymakers will be able to use the map to conduct some work about the mitigation, right, or about the response in case of the crisis event. So this work was inspired by the work of niche. According to Cambridge Dictionary, a niche is just a hollow in a wall, especially one made to put a statue in so that it can be seen. So this is a niche. So niche has been adopted in ecological studies. So we have the concept called ecological niche. So ecological niche is usually determined by many various critical factors such as temperature, precipitation, etc. So in this work, we were interested in building the niche of tourists. In other words, the geographic distribution of tourists, and we want to explore the factors that contribute to the distribution of tourists. So as we know that the tourist distribution could be affected, influenced by the surrounding environment. So we want to learn how the environmental factors are related to the tourist distribution. So we use the niche modeling method called maximum entropy modeling. So how does this work? First of all, we need to collect information about known tourist distribution. So this information can be obtained through social media data. And then we get the environmental layers. Then we use the machine learning to draw the correlation between the tourist distribution layer and the environmental layer. After that, we can create a probability map showing the presence of tourists in the study area. And then we can also project the distribution in space and time based on the correlation. Okay. This is about how the model works. This is our study area in San Diego, in the United States of America. So we have the black dots here, which are the known tourist distribution points obtained from Flickr photos contributed by Flickr users. And these red dots are those tourism points of interest. So you can see the overlap between these two point layers, right? So this is the downtown area. We collect the data using Flickr API. The data collection was free. And this table shows the data that we collected. So after we obtain the data from the API, we classify the photos into tourist photos and non-tourist photos based on the user profiles, which can also be obtained from the API. So the classification was conducted based on the user's current residential city and hometown city. And then we also removed the photos from those users whose occupation were photographers or photography related, because we want to focus on those tourist photos. And then we removed the photos with these keywords in their titles, such as conference and meeting, as it is possible that the photos were taken or for non-sightseeing purposes. So this ensured that the quality of the classification, ensure that most of ensure that the photos were contributed by tourists. And one of the main issues in social media data is about the power law distribution, or it's called the long tail distribution. So meaning that a few users contribute most of the social media data, while meaning that a few social media users contribute a lot of data, while most of the users only contribute just a few data. So to minimize the bias here, we remove the users who contribute more than 20 photos, because the curve, the tail lands at 20, around 20. So we remove the photos, these photos from the users who contribute more than 20 photos. So these are the number of photos involved in the modeling. This is the seasonal distribution of the photos. We have more photos from spring and summer. So for the environmental layers, we use the 5 environmental layers here. So including first land use and land parcel, digital elevation model. And this one is about the distance to the nearest major road. And this one is for the distance to the nearest transit stop, which could be the tram stops or the bus stops. And then we conduct the pairwise Pearson correlation and the VIF analysis to ensure there was no multi-collinear issue among the continuous variables. So in the data training, we use the typical data splitting method. 75% of the data was used for training, and the 25% was used for testing. So we use this method to evaluate the model performance, called the receiver operating characteristics. So basically, we need to evaluate the area under this curve. If the area under this curve is greater than the threshold, which is 0.75, then it means that model performance was acceptable. And this black line is a random guess line. So this curve should be away from this random guess line, meaning that the prediction is better than random. So for our training and test data set, for both of them, the AOC value were greater than the threshold. So the model performance was accepted. And we also conducted a cross validation, meaning that we conduct the data splitting randomly 4 times, and then we calculate the AOC value. The average AOC value was also acceptable. And then we also performed the binomial test of omission to show that the model predicted the test localities significantly better than random. Okay. So this is the result. This is the resulting tourist distribution map. So this is the downtown area of San Diego. So we have an aircraft carrier museum around this area. So this is a park. So basically, darker areas represent high probability of tourist presence. So on the right side, we have a map showing the seasonal variations of the map. So we conducted the modeling 4 times for the 4 different seasons. And then we calculate the coefficient of variation for the 4 outputs, and we get this map showing down seasonal uncertainty. We found out that in this area we have darker polygon, darker area, showing high variation across the seasons. And we look into this area, we found that this is a military airport, and there is an air show on every usually on every autumn. So it means that tourists only go to this area on the season with the air show. So that's why we observed the seasonal variations, high seasonal variations in here around this area. Okay. So you can see the runway. This is the runway of the military airport. And then we conducted the jackknife test on the test data set to evaluate which variable contribute most to the distribution of tourists. We found out that land use contribute the most, followed by land parcel and distance to the transit stops, and DEM. The least important one is distance to the nearest major roads. So this analysis was conducted based on the test dataset AOC. For instance, for this one, if we only include these 4 variables in the modeling without using LU land use, and we found out that AOC value decreased the most. It means that the LU value is the most important. Similarly, for this one, if you only use the LU, the land use in the modeling, we can see that the AOC value is the greatest, also suggesting that the land use is the most important variable. Next, based on the probability map, we extracted the land use types that attract tourists most. We extracted top 10 land use types. So the first one is the convention center, that's followed by the beach area. The third one is the tourist attractions. The fourth one is other public services, and followed by hotel, motel, stadium, arena, arterial commercial area, resort, and the 10th one is the regional shopping center. These are 3 response curves showing how the 3 continuous variables respond to the tourist distribution. So for these 2, this one is about the distance to the nearest major road, and this one is about the distance to the nearest transit stop. So we can see that when we go away from the major roads or go away from the transit stops, the probability of tourist presence decreased. Right. For DEM is the elevation. So we found out that the tourist distribution can mostly be observed at low elevation area. But when the elevation, when the height goes up, we also see the curve rises. So we look into the data again. So we found out that the mountainous areas also attract tourists. So that's the reason this curve rise up. So some tourists like to go for hiking in the mountainous area. So this is the last part of the research. Because we mentioned earlier, the correlation can be projected in space and time. So we performed 2 simulations. We simulated 2 disaster and crisis scenario, and then we calculate the change of the probability of tourist presence in the 2 simulated scenarios. So what we did was to change the value of the environmental layers, and then we used the correlation learned by the machine learning method, and then we create a new probability map. Then by comparing the newly created map with the map that we created earlier, then we can calculate the differences. Then we'll be able to assess the inference of different disaster and crisis scenarios on the tourist distribution. Okay, so these are the 2 scenarios. So I'm not gonna dive deep into this. So yeah, I think I'm 1 minute over time. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to your question and comments and suggestion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yingwei, for such an interesting presentation. So now we have time for Q&A. So I can see there are already 4 questions here. So I would like to go through, I would like you to respond. So first, we can take the first questions. And this is for Chen-Chieh. So how, basically they want to know, how did you determine if a tweet reflects trust or joy or anticipation, because they are highly correlated.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I actually see 2 questions. They're all kind of accuracy related in terms of how these sentiments are extracted. So let me just briefly talk about the first one. So basically, I didn't determine it, but the software package determined it. So I have to go to look at how this Suzette package determining the sentiment. So they're basically using basically human labeled, a list of word and looking at the word and say this is a particular sentiment. And then in terms of implementation, they look into the sentences and look for words that represents a particular type of sentiment. And the algorithm is actually quite straightforward. The particular option that we use is pretty much just adding those score up, and eventually it will give us a number. So, so I don't know if that the package actually will be able to handle interconnectedness of the feeling, especially when it crosses over from trust to joy or from joy to anticipation, because it's kind of word-based. If you look into natural language processing literature, they're also talking about sentence-based kind of things, which is more complicated. So I guess this would needs a little bit of collaboration with folks from computing to look at exactly in terms of how accurate the algorithm is reflecting exactly trust and joy and anticipation, for example.
Great. I also have some questions, but I will ask later. So let's move to the next one, which is for Michelle from Wilson Chua. So basically, wants to know whether is there a separate chart for COVID and trust institutions, trust in institutions, because I think it was not shown in the PPT.
Here you go. There wasn't, but then there's one now. Let's see if I can find it. Oops. So one thing to note is that so one thing to stress is that there was actually no difference in the means for no COVID salience and COVID salience. So this is just a histogram that tells you the frequency of responses. So, I mean, the majority of the participants indicated 4. So again, the maximum possible response is actually only 5. So almost 40% indicated 5, which is the best response that is possible that they can indicate, or the highest level of trust. And so here you go.
So great. So I think I also have a related questions here, because this is very interesting variable, but I was wondering, why didn't you include it as an IV instead of BV? Because I'm not so sure how your manipulation will affect trust in institutions, and what would be the logical thing here.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I did think that COVID-19 was going to increase trust, just because during times of crisis, we want to look to somebody for, for answers. And also because I think the default level of trust is already high. So I was just expecting, just like with an amplification of the tendencies for global orientation, I was expecting an amplification of the default tendency to trust the government. I'm not sure, I mean, this could be a methodological artifact if, they didn't, I didn't give them a high enough range of response, broad, wide enough range of responses. So maybe we could have seen differences where during COVID-19, then, well, under COVID-19 salience, then trust becomes even greater than before. So that was the rationale.
Okay, great. So the next question is for Yingwei. So basically, he wants to know, why did you remove photos with more than 20? Why should tourists with more than 20 photos be removed from the study?
Okay, thank you for this question. In fact, this is a very common issue in social media data that has been discussed in articles about VGI. So people call this power law distribution or long tail distribution because some people are very passionate and they contribute a lot of information. And when we look into, for our case, for our data set, when we look into these users, we found out that most of the photos are, most of the data contributed by them were like the bulk import. So they import a lot of data at the same time, and most of the photos are concentrated in a small area. So in order to reduce the bias of this, so we determined to remove the photos from these users. But of course, there are many different methods for handling this power law distribution issue that has been discussed in the literature. This is the one that I used, and there are also other statistical methods to understand the patterns of the photos, or in the case of Twitter data, there are also methods to handle this in Twitter data set. So basically, it's just for reduce the bias from those very passionate or biased users. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is very interesting, I think, and this is very important methodological issue. And this also goes back to Chen-Chieh paper, because I was also wondering, when you were looking or analyzing sentiment, did you also look at the distribution? So were there certain users who were more active? So maybe some users, so I wanted to know, like, how many unique users were there in your sample, and if some users were contributing more actively as compared to other users?
We didn't look at the more active user or less active users. But in terms of, I did have a number of, let's see, somewhere I can't remember on the slides, a number of the users that we collected, roughly about 12,000. Yep.
So I think there is one more question for Yingwei.
Okay.
Very simple.
DNMR and DNTS. DNMR represents the distance to the nearest major road, and DNTS represents the distance to the nearest transit stops. The transit stops could be the in San Diego. They are the tram stations and the bus stops. Yeah.
So I have a question for you, because this is very excuse me, very interesting area of study. And as the context is very different, San Diego, and then again, if you look at Singapore, it's a very, very different kind of a tourist destinations. And then if you have to apply this kind of crisis management study. So how applicable this would be in the context of Singapore, which is very densely populated, and could there be some practical issue here or methodological issue?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think this is very important question. So we conducted modeling for San Diego, and before we used the 5 environmental variables, we actually conducted some preliminary analysis to explore a lot of variables. And these 5 variables were the selected ones. But for the case of Singapore, I believe that we also need to conduct exploratory analysis to include all possible variables and we can use the AUC, area under curve method, to determine which variable contribute most, or we can make the hypothesis to select the most important ones and make the modeling for Singapore. And for the case of Singapore, so maybe we can also use other types of social media data. So because Flickr data is used less popular nowadays, perhaps we can consider combining multiple types of social media, such as Instagram, Twitter, and Flickr, and some other Chinese version social media data like Weibo. So we could possibly look into the multiple social media data and fuse them. And we could also look into multiple variables that are more suitable for the case of Singapore, for the context of Singapore. And then we conduct the modeling, then we will be able to see whether the model performed good. And then we can validate the result. For San Diego, the validation was conducted by comparing the distribution with the POIs, the points of interest. So we conducted some statistical analysis, and we found out that the match between the tourism POIs and the probability map that we modeled, they match very well. So in Singapore, we can also perform the evaluation and validation. Yeah, thank you.
Great. And I think this goes back to Chen-Chieh presentation, because one of the things that you highlighted, how some of these big data could be used or could be, could be exploited for managing human crisis, and that is also one of the theme of this particular session or panel. So I was intrigued, like what would be the implication of some of the things that you have analyzed in your research? So for example, emotions, so how does it help in answering or addressing the COVID crisis that unfolded or is still unfolding, And the second thing, which also Yingwei pointed out about the validation of the data, so this is how do you really validate Twitter data with other kind of data that could help in understanding what has been happening in the real world? And again, just to add here, because one of the important themes that has emerged right from the beginning, from the presentation of Professor Sandy about moving from big data to broad data, so we should have more meaningful data that could help in addressing or resolving human crisis or any kind of practical situations. And that should be the purpose of computational social science. So how do you really look at this?
Yep. So I think one of the characteristics about social media is actually, I think it reflects very quickly about what's going on the ground. We all know that after we do the analysis, sometimes we get this response about, so what, we already know it. But at the same time, it provides you almost near real-time response to it, even though we have to be somewhat cautious about whether or not it's representative. So there's a whole bunch of issues related to that. So if you remember earlier, I was talking about this kind of analysis is at least provide partial evidence. Okay, I'm kind of very cautious about that. But in a way that we can verify it, but at the same time, it perhaps provides some indication of what's going on in near real time. And the other things that I like about social media is reflecting the opinion for those on the ground. It's not reflecting perhaps the opinion of the government. So in a way, if you look at how the policy, how we should devise the policy, there's always this alternative view that we can look at. Whether or not we agree or disagree is a different thing, but having an alternative view is very important. Yeah, so in terms of time sensitivity and in terms of alternative view, in terms of how, if we really trust the information from social media, then we could perhaps consider some of the alternative reflecting from the ground.
Great. So I have one question for Michelle.
Sure.
Yeah. Do you have some question or?
No, I thought there's a second part of the question that Yingwei would have to answer.
Okay.
Is it?
Go ahead.
Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
No, I was just, I wanted to know the validity of the data. So I think you have answered it, no? The implication of the findings in terms of real life policy making or any impact.
Okay.
Okay.
So, so I have a question for Michelle about the findings. So because this is very interesting, you know, so how things, it is a momental in some way, you know, so it happens in that moment when the crisis is unfolding, and then you are trying to measure how people are responding to this kind of crisis and how some of the pre-existing attitudes really help in resolving those issues. So, but I was just thinking, what would happen if you are to do the same study after what we may call like rise of beta variant, you know?
Yeah. That's such a, yeah. I mean, that's such a great question, because we did try to do it again. And so when we did this was, these were data collected in February and March. And so that's when the first outbreak was just beginning, and then we had the dormitories. And with the Delta variant, as time changes, I think the operationalizations might change, but the underlying principles will still be the same. And so I think we would try to do this again, you know, after the Delta outbreak, but this time we're talking about willingness to interact with Indian nationals as opposed to mainland Chinese. I think that's where we'll find the strongest effects. But, you know, it's the underlying psychological mechanism is still the same, in that it's still a response about amplifying default tendencies during crisis. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So because I think this would be very interesting to see, because maybe there is some other variables which would be more important here, maybe assimilation or maybe multiculturalism. So those are, I think, the important factors to take into account. And do you have any questions for the panelists, any of you? Or
I actually had a question for Dr. Feng, if there's time to.
Yeah, we still have 10 minutes.
Okay, so I thought it was very interesting that Dr. Feng was measuring different emotions, and he had categorized them according to the valence of emotions, so positive and negative emotions. I was inspired also by Tabarez's question about the users, like, do you actually have the information which user is generating which emotions? And I'm wondering, the reason I'm asking this is because I I'm wondering if you have looked at ambivalence before as a construct. So by ambivalence, I'm talking about the simultaneous experience of positive and negative emotions, right? So I'm thinking like as a reaction, psychological reaction to crisis, sometimes, yay, we want to be resilient and we want to take joy over in the small wins. But at the same time, we're also feeling, oh, yet another measure, or, you know, so there's this mixture of positive and negative emotions. And I wonder if you have looked at it in your data to see if there are fluctuations in that.
Thank you very much. That would be my future direction. But yeah, we didn't look at that, but I think individual record, we can track down to the ID. So definitely, I think that's a very good suggestion that we could look at. And that also means that we need to take the Suzette package and try to recode it a little bit. It's not very difficult. Yeah, so we could try to recode it a little bit and see if there's simultaneous response at the same time by looking at individual records. Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, thanks for the suggestion. Something, I think that's the beauty of the forum, right? So sometimes we don't think about certain things and others will contribute. Thank you very much.
So if I can ask all the panelists the final reflection or reflective question. So if you have to look at your research from the vantage point of computational social science, what do you think, like how your research could help in answering some of the existing questions? Here we are dealing with a human crisis, you know, so how it helps in answering those issues in a better way or not, or what additional thing you would like to add to your existing study? Both, it could be either methodological or any theoretical thing that you'd like to add to your existing studies that you can think could help in answering some of the critical questions in a better way. So
You need to tell us who to start. You want me to start?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I think I want to extend more into that language domain. Not exactly the study of language per se, but looking at different group. Because I was in conversation with my friends in the US and they were talking about the COVID situation in the US where the Spanish speaking folks and then the other language groups, they have different strategy to handle COVID-19 and either the misinformations or other type of information get communicated within different groups are very, very different. So originally, when I tried to do this language thing in Singapore, that's because we're a multi-ethnic community. So I really want to know roughly about what would be the possible responses from different groups. Okay, so if I can extend that with better tools or at least better tools, but just using the same data sets, but across the world, but better tool to see a more precise description of how different groups will be coping with COVID-19 crisis. That would be great. The second things that I hope that this kind of research would expand into, if you notice that everything that I presented is based on time series or time series data, but originally when we started, we really want to see geographic differences. It's not just temporal differences, but also geographic differences. And especially for this kind of research, we always want to see physical spaces and virtual space and the combination of it. Okay. So, but in Singapore, the problem is Singapore is just too small. So if you look at spatial resolution, at least you get north, south, east, west, and that's pretty much it. And we all know that there's the geocoding, geotagging issues in social media. Yeah. So I think so this kind of question kind of related to a question that's constantly on my mind. So when we're doing this kind of research with social media data, what would be the best data set we can have? Okay, what kind of spatial resolution can we get out of it? If not, are we able to enrich the data in a certain way? So that becomes a data enrichment type of project for certain research. So in short, it's basically looking at different groups and expanding into spatial temporal analysis.
Great. Michelle, would you like to go next?
Yeah, okay. So I guess so the research that I presented today is not computational at all. It's an experiment, and I do think that the two approaches can complement each other rather than be mutually exclusive. So for instance, the time series approach that Dr. Feng was talking about, I think is really interesting because in terms of talking about amplification, what I've done is looked at amplification by comparing two different groups. But it would be, I think the approach that he and his collaborators are using might allow us to look at individual level analysis of amplification over time. I think one of the challenges would, for taking a computational approach to understanding psychology would be, how do we map psychological constructs to big data? Or how do we infer, social media behavior? How do we make inferences about psychology from social media behavior? And I think some of the social psychologists have started to do this, and I'm excited to see more. And maybe in 2 years' time, when this forum is held again, then I'll have some computational results. Results using computational approaches to present and share. So.
Thanks. Great. So, Yingwei?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe let me share a little bit. So, because I just talk about the 4 phases about disaster and crisis management. So it has the mitigation phase, preparation phase, and response phase, and recovery phase. So most of the existing studies on at least in the field of GIS, they focus on the response phase. So few study focus on the recovery phase and the mitigation and the early warning phase. So we have recently conducted several studies focusing on the recovery phase using the social media data, including Twitter data and Flickr data. But we found some uncertainties within the study. For instance, we just discussed about the user bias and the validation issue. So I think one of the reasons researchers don't focus a lot on the recovery phase because there are some difficulties in the data collection, the long-term data collection, and also the social media bias involved. So in the future, we perhaps I'm thinking about to still work on the recovery phase and other phases, but we need to explore methods to minimize the uncertainties of social media data and combine the social media data and the traditional data sets, not just using social media data, because our previous studies focusing on the recovery phase use only the social media data. But perhaps we can combine these 2 data sets. Maybe we will get a better result. And for instance, for the COVID-19 management. So I think we haven't reached the recovery phase yet, but in the future, perhaps integrating the official data source and the social media data, we'll be able to better understand the recovery after the COVID-19 crisis. And also for the pre-warning phase, preparation phase, I'm thinking about if we combine the traditional early warning method and the social media data method, whether we can provide a better early warning solution. So maybe we can, before, like for instance, before the earthquake, if we combine these 2, whether we will be able to send some more timely warning to citizens, yeah, that's the idea that in my mind. We will explore this in the future. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I think a lot of important takeaway from all the three presentations. So I would invite all to join me for thanking all the three panelists for such a insightful and very interesting presentations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.